She was 40 years old. The autumn everything she had ever built was taken from her, and she stood at the edge of the continent with $11 folded into the hem of her sleeve and nowhere in the world that would call her by name. Her husband's brother, Elias Thorne, had cast her out of the farmhouse she and Samuel had raised board by board, saying a widow with no son had no claim to Thorneland, that the deed spoke his name now, and the law spoke louder than grief. She had walked from the valley with those $11, a wool coat, and a tin box of her mother's sewing needles. And when she reached the gray fishing village of Harrow's Reach on the Maine coast in the fall of 1887, she spent nearly all of it, $10, counted twice into a stranger's palm on a sagging, salt-eaten lighthouse that no keeper would touch, condemned and forgotten, on a spit of rock the villagers called Widow's Finger. It was a foolish thing to buy, everyone told her so, a leaning tower of rot with a dead lamp and stairs that groaned like a dying animal. But beneath those stairs, sealed away where no one had thought to look in 30 years, lay something that would not only lift her from ruin, but bring an entire drowning town back to life. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Miriam Thorne. And if you are watching tonight, from someplace the world has quietly written off a town, a house, a season of your life that everyone else has already given up on, tell us where you're from in the comments, because this story was made for you. She had not always been a woman standing alone in the wind. Miriam was born Miriam Vale, the youngest daughter of a clockmaker in the inland town of Cheswick, where her father kept a shop that smelled of brass shavings and lamp oil and the faint sweetness of the pipe he was never supposed to smoke indoors. Amos Vale was a patient man, and he raised his daughters the way he wound his clock slowly, carefully, with an ear tuned to the smallest wrongness in a sound. Miriam's sisters grew restless in that shop, but Miriam did not. She would sit on the high stool for hours, her small fingers learning the geography of gears, learning that a thing which seemed broken was almost never broken all the way through, that patience and a steady hand could coax life back into what others had already thrown into the scrap bin. Her father used to say that the world was full of people who mistook silence for death, who saw a stopped clock and assumed it could never keep time again. "But you and I know better, Miri," he would tell her, holding a ruined pocket watch up to the window light. "We know that most things are only waiting for someone willing to look closer." From him, she learned mechanisms, but from her mother, Ada, she learned the older and quieter craft of making do. Ada Vale could turn a torn flour sack into a child's dress, could stretch a Sunday chicken across a week of suppers, could mend a fishing net or a fractured heart with the same unhurried competence. When money ran thin, as it often did in Cheswick's hard winters, Ada never spoke of it as shame. She spoke of it as a puzzle. "There is always something here we haven't yet used properly," she would murmur, moving through the pantry. And somehow there always was. Miriam grew up believing, in the marrow of her, that scarcity was not the same as poverty, that a resourceful woman was never truly empty-handed as long as she could see clearly. She married Samuel Thorne at 22, a broad, laughing man who had come to Cheswick to buy timber and stayed to court the clockmaker's daughter. He took her back to the Thorne farm in the coastal valley, a good stretch of land with an apple orchard and a view of the distant sea on clear mornings. They were not wealthy, but they were sufficient, and Miriam poured her inherited gifts into that farm with everything she had. She repaired the failing irrigation wheel that Samuel's father had left to rust. She kept the account books in a hand so neat. The feed merchant once asked to frame a page. She nursed sick lambs by the kitchen stove and mended the roof herself when the hired man quit. For 18 years, she and Samuel worked side by side, childless but not joyless. And if she sometimes felt the ache of the empty nursery upstairs, she filled it with labor and with the deep, ordinary contentment of a life well tended. She believed in those years that effort was a kind of contract with the world, that if you gave a place your whole self, it could not simply cast you off. She was wrong about that, and learning how wrong would nearly break her. But even the breaking could not touch what her mother and father had sown into her. The eye that saw value where others saw ruin, the hands that refused to quit, and the stubborn, unfashionable belief that the forgotten things of this world are only waiting for someone willing to look closer. That belief was the one inheritance no man could sign away from her. She would need every ounce of it before the winter was through. The fall came the way the worst falls. Always do not in a single blow, but in a slow unspooling that she did not recognize as the end until it was already finished. Samuel took a fever in the spring of 1887, a wet, rattling thing that settled in his chest and would not be coaxed out no matter how Miriam steamed the bedroom with kettles or brewed her mother's remedies of honey and horehound. He faded over 6 weeks, apologizing to her at the end for leaving the fences half mended, and she held his hand and told him the fences did not matter, that nothing mattered but that he rest. When he was gone, she buried him under the oldest apple tree, the one whose blossoms he had loved, and she thought in her grief that at least the land remained, that she would carry the farm forward the way she had carried everything else. She had not counted on Elias. Samuel's younger brother had gone west years before, chasing schemes that never quite paid, and he returned to Harrow's Reach that summer thin and hard-eyed, with a lawyer from the county seat and a copy of the original Thorne deed. The land, he claimed, had never legally passed to Samuel at all their father had died intestate, and by the letter of an old inheritance statute that favored surviving brothers over widows without issue, the farm reverted to Elias. Miriam did not believe it could be true. She had the account books, the 18 years of her own sweat pressed into every acre. But the law, she learned, does not read account books. It reads names on paper, and her name was on nothing. The judge in the county courthouse was an old friend of the Thorne family, and he ruled from the bench in under an hour. She was given 3 weeks to remove her personal effects and vacate. The neighbors she had fed through hard winters looked at their boots when she passed. The feed merchant who had once wanted to frame her handwriting no longer met her eye. Elias, for his part, was not even cruel about it. That was somehow the worst of it. He was merely certain, merely comfortable, the way men are comfortable when the world has always been arranged in their favor. He offered her a small sum to leave quietly, for Samuel's sake. And when she refused to take his money, he shrugged as though her pride were a curiosity that did not concern him. On her last morning, she walked the orchard one final time, laid her palm against the bark of the apple tree where Samuel slept, and made herself a promise she was not sure she could keep, that she would not let this be the shape of the rest of her life, that she would build something again, somewhere, that no man could sign away. But promises are cold company on an empty road. She sold what few things were legally hers, her wedding quilt, a copper pot, Samuel's good boots to a farmhand who needed them, and gathered $11 and some coins. She kept her mother's tin box of needles and her father's smallest set of watchmaker's tools because she could not bear to part with the hands that had made her. And she walked the coast road south, past villages that had no work for a widow of 40, past boarding houses that wanted rent she did not have, until she came at last, footsore and hollow, to the wind-scoured huddle of Harrow's Reach. It was a town that looked, she thought, as beaten as she felt a fishing village whose fleet had thinned year by year, whose young men had drifted to the cities, whose harbor mouth had grown treacherous with shifting shoals that swallowed boats and hope in equal measure. It was, she would come to understand, a town that had also lost everything and was only pretending, out of habit, to still be alive. She had not come there to save it. She had come there only because she had nowhere else to go. But sometimes the forgotten recognize their own and reach for one another in the dark. She learned of the lighthouse on her second day in Harrow's Reach from a leather-faced old woman named Cora Bly, who ran the town's single boarding house and let Miriam sleep one night in exchange for mending a week's worth of torn linens. Over thin coffee, Cora told her the story the way you tell a thing you have long since stopped hoping about. There had been a lighthouse once on Widow's Finger, the rock spit that guarded the harbor mouth. And while its lamp burned, the town had prospered, for ships could make the channel safely even in fog, and the fishing fleet could run at all hours. But 30 years back, the last keeper, a strange and solitary man named Ephraim Locke, had died out there alone, and the town had been too poor and too quarrelsome to fund a replacement. The light went dark. The shoals took their toll. Insurance men marked the harbor dangerous. The packet ships stopped calling, and Harrow's Reach began its long slide into the sea of forgetting. Now the county wanted the derelict tower off its books entirely. It could be had, Cora said with a dry laugh, for $10, and the fool's errand of owning it. Though what a body would do with a rotted stub of stone on a rock the tide half drowns, I surely could not tell you. Miriam did not laugh. Something in her had gone very still, the same stillness her father used to fall into when he lifted a broken watch to the light. A lighthouse was, when you thought about it, only a very large machine for keeping a promise, a mechanism for saying to every soul out on the black water, "You are seen, you are not alone, there is a way home." And a town without its light was only a town waiting for someone willing to look closer. She counted her money that night in the dark of Cora's spare room, $11 and some coins, and she understood that to buy the lighthouse would leave her with almost nothing at all. It was reckless. It was, by every measure the world would use, the act of a woman who had lost her senses along with her home. She bought it anyway. The county agent came through Harrow's Reach that Thursday, and Miriam Thorne pressed $10 into his palm, counted twice, and signed her name, her own name, at last, on a paper that gave her something no man could tick to the deed of the condemned widow's fingerlight. They ferried her out at low tide in a dory, Cora Bly and a taciturn fisherman named Jonah Reddick, who rode with the air of a man humoring the doomed. Up close, the lighthouse was worse than the stories. It leaned, truly leaned, a good few degrees off true where the seaward foundation had settled, and the whitewash had long since surrendered to green-black streaks of algae and rust weeping from the iron fittings. The door hung on one hinge. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot, and old salt, and something mineral and cold, and gray light fell through the broken lantern room far above, onto a spiral of wooden stairs that spiraled up into shadow. Miriam set down her tin box and her tools, and she did not weep, though she wanted to. She simply began, as her mother had taught her, by taking inventory of what was there. And it was in that first careful accounting, running her hands along the base of the staircase where it met the stone floor, testing each board for rot, that her fingers found the wrongness. One of the lowest treads did not ring hollow the way rotted wood should. It rang, faintly, of metal. Something had been fitted into the space beneath the bottom of the stairs, and someone had gone to great trouble, long ago, to make it look like nothing at all. She did not force it open that first day, though her heart urged her to. Night was falling, and the tide was rising, and Jonah Reddick would not risk the return in the dark, so the three of them made a rough camp in the keeper's room off the base of the tower, where a cast-iron stove still stood, and a few sticks of furniture remained under 30 years of dust. But at first light, while Cora slept and Jonah checked his dory, Miriam took her father's smallest pry tool and went back to the stairs. The lowest 3 treads, she discovered, were not treads at all in the ordinary sense. They had been built as a cunning hinged lid, a compartment disguised as the foot of the staircase, its seams packed with tallow and grime to hide them. It took her the better part of an hour of patient work, the same patience she had learned on the high stool in her father's shop, before the false stairs lifted with a groan of protesting iron. And there, in the dry stone cavity beneath, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as bark, lay the buried secret of Ephraim Lock. There were 3 things inside, and Miriam lifted each out into the pale morning light with hands that had begun, against her will, to tremble. The first was a leather-bound logbook, its pages swollen but legible, filled with a cramped and lonely hand. The second was a heavy canvas sack that clinked when she moved it, and when she loosened its throat, she found not the pirate's gold her wild imagination had leapt to, but coins, nonetheless, dozens upon dozens of gold and silver pieces, the accumulated savings of a frugal man's whole solitary life, a keeper's wages hoarded across decades with no one to spend them on. And the third thing was a packet of letters and legal papers bound in faded blue ribbon, and it was these, not the coins, that would prove to be the true treasure. Miriam sat on the cold stone floor and read Ephraim Lock's logbook first, and as she read, she began to understand that she had not merely bought a ruined tower. She had inherited a man's grief and his penance, and the unfinished promise he had carried alone into the dark. Ephraim Lock, the log revealed, had not always been a hermit. He had come to Harrow's Reach as a young man with a wife, Hannah, and an infant daughter, and for a few bright years the little family had kept the light together, and the town had thrived around them. But a winter fever, the same kind of wet, merciless fever that would one day take Samuel, had swept the coast, and Hannah had died of it, and the infant girl, too weak to be moved to the mainland doctor across the storm-lashed channel, had died in Ephraim's arms 3 nights later, while he kept the lamp burning for ships he could not save his own child from. He wrote of it plainly, which made it worse. He wrote that he had kept the light every night after without fail for 26 years, because it was the one promise left to him that death could not break that as long as he burned it. No other father would lose his family for want of a way home through the dark. And he wrote, in the last pages, of the coins. He had saved every wage the county paid him, spending almost nothing, because he had formed a plan he did not live to finish. He meant to leave his fortune to the town of Harrow's Reach, in trust, to endow the light forever, so that when he was gone, it would never again go dark. The letters in blue ribbon were his correspondence with a lawyer in Portland, drafting exactly such a bequest, and the last document, unsigned, undated, was the will itself, halted mid-sentence, as though death had come for him on an ordinary evening between one dutiful act and the next. Miriam understood, sitting there in the cold, what had happened. Ephraim Locke had died before he could sign the will, and so his fortune had simply vanished from the knowledge of the living, sealed beneath the stairs where he had hidden it for safekeeping until the lawyer's papers could be finalized. No heir had ever come. The town had assumed the strange old keeper died as poor as they were, and had let his light and his memory rot together on Widow's finger. But the log made one thing luminously, achingly clear. Ephraim had never intended a single coin of it for himself or for any private heir. Every word he had written bent toward one purpose: the light, the town, the promise that no family be lost for want of guidance home. And Miriam, who had lost her own home to a man who read only the names on papers, felt the whole shape of her life turn on its hinge in that moment. She had come to Widow's Finger with nothing, seeking only a roof. She had found instead a dead man's last wish, and a fortune, and a choice: to keep the coins and slip quietly away to a comfortable, anonymous life, somewhere far from the sea, or to become herself, the fulfillment of a promise a lonely man had carried unfinished to his grave. She was a long time deciding nothing at all, because in truth she had known the answer the moment she read his daughter's name. For she had recognized something of herself in Ephraim Locke, 2 people the world had counted as finished, sitting 30 years apart in the same cold tower, both of them refusing to let the light go out. And she thought of her father's words, that most things are only waiting for someone willing to look closer. Ephraim's gold had been waiting 3 decades in the dark. The town had been waiting far longer. Miriam Thorne folded the oilcloth back over the coins, but she kept the blue ribbon papers close against her chest, and when Jonah Reddick rowed them back to Harrow's Reach on the noontide, she carried with her not the joy of a woman made suddenly rich, but the grave and steadying weight of a woman given, at last, something worth doing. She did not yet know that her intention to honor a dead man's wish would set her against the living, that there were those in Harrow's Reach, and one man far beyond it, who would see the discovery beneath the stairs not as a promise to keep, but as a prize to seize. Word travels fast in a dying town, and there is no keeping a secret ferried in on a fisherman's dory. Cora Bly was loyal, and Jonah Reddick was close-mouthed. But the mere sight of Miriam returning from the derelict light with a guarded expression and a bundle held close was enough to set tongues moving in the Harborside Tavern. By the week's end, the story had grown in the telling, as such stories do, until half of Harrow's Reach believed the widow on Widow's Finger had found a chest of Spanish doubloons, and the other half believed she was mad, and a few believed both at once. Most of the villagers, being decent and beaten-down folk, felt only a dull, wistful curiosity. But the town's fortunes had for years been quietly held in the fist of one man, and that man did not deal in curiosity. He dealt in leverage. His name was Harlan Crocker, and he owned the general store, the fish-buying scales at the wharf, the mortgages on half the houses in town, and the loyalty bought, or frightened, of the harbor master and the county clerk. He was the sort of man who prospers precisely because a place is failing, for a drowning town will sell itself cheaply to anyone who offers a rope, and Crocker had spent 20 years buying Harrow's Reach at ruinous rates and calling it charity. When he heard that a penniless widow had found something valuable beneath the old light, Crocker did what such men always do. He consulted the law, or rather, the letter of it, and the letter, he believed, was on his side. He came to Cora Bly's boarding house on a gray afternoon, dressed too well for the room, and laid out his position with the smooth reasonableness of a man who has never once doubted he would get his way. The deed Miriam had bought, he explained, conveyed only the structure and the rock it stood on. Any chattel, any movable property, any coin discovered within was a separate matter. And as the derelict had stood on county land improperly transferred, and as he, Crocker, held certain liens against the county's coastal holdings dating back years, why, any treasure found there was arguably his. He smiled when he said it. He offered her $100 to hand over whatever trinkets she'd dug up and sign a paper renouncing further claim, and he made it clear, gently, that a woman alone in a town where he owned the clerk and the constable would be unwise to refuse. Miriam listened to all of it in silence, her hands folded in her lap, and Harlan Crocker mistook her stillness for the paralysis of a cornered woman. He did not know that he was the second man to sit across from her and explain, with perfect comfort, that the law read only names on paper and that her sweat and her rightful claim were nothing beside it. He did not know that she had already lost everything once to exactly this kind of certainty, and that a person who has already been to the bottom is very hard to frighten with the threat of falling. When he finished, she asked him a single question. She asked whether he had ever met Ephraim Locke. Crocker, Throne said he had as a boy. He'd seen the old keeper come ashore for supplies. And did he know, Miriam asked, what the keeper had wanted done with his savings? Crocker did not, and did not care. "The dead don't own property, Mrs. Thorne," he said, recovering his smile. "The living do, and in this town, that's me." She rose then, and thanked him for his time, and told him she would consider his offer, which was true, in a sense, though not the sense he took from it. That night she did not sleep. She read Ephraim's unsigned will again by candlelight, and the letters to the Portland lawyer, and she saw with cold clarity that Crocker was not entirely wrong about the danger. If she simply revealed the coins, he would tie the matter up in the county court he controlled until she was starved out, exactly as Elias had starved her out of the farm. The law of names on paper would beat her again. Unless, and here, her father's patient, mechanical mind woke fully within her, unless she could find the one name on paper that outranked them all. The answer was in the blue-ribboned packet, and it had been there all along. Among Ephraim Locke's letters was the full name and firm of the Portland lawyer, one Josiah Ainsworth, Esquire, and the file number of the trust he had been drafting. The will was unsigned, yes, but a will is not the only instrument of intention, and Ephraim, being a careful man, had done more than draft it. In one letter he referenced a deposit he had already made, a preliminary conveyance, properly witnessed and signed years before his death, placing his savings in trust with Ainsworth's firm the moment they should be recovered. With the town of Harrow's Reach named as beneficiary and the standing of the light as the trust's sole purpose, the coins beneath the stairs were merely the physical corpus. The legal soul of the bequest already existed, executed, and binding, gathering dust in a Portland law office because no one had ever come forward with the missing treasure to trigger it. Ephraim had built a mechanism, and like all good mechanisms, it had simply been waiting 30 years for someone willing to look closer and set it running again. Harlan Crocker's liens meant nothing against a signed and witnessed trust that predated them. Miriam did not need to fight him for the gold. She needed only to deliver it to its rightful owner, which had never for one moment been her. She moved carefully, the way she had learned to move among delicate gears. She could not trust the county clerk or the constable, both in Crocker's pocket, so she went instead to Jonah Reddick, who owed no man in Harrow's Reach, and hated Crocker with the clean hatred of one who had watched his father sign away their boat. Jonah sailed her up the coast to Portland himself, 2 days each way, the coins hidden beneath nets in the bottom of his dory, and Miriam carried Ephraim's logbook, and the blue ribbon papers wrapped in oilcloth against her body. Josiah Ainsworth was an old man now, near retirement, and when Miriam laid the packet on his desk and he recognized his own younger hand on the trust conveyance, the color went out of his face and then came flooding back with something she could only call joy. He remembered Ephraim Locke. He had wondered, for 30 years, whatever had become of the keeper and his strange, tender determination to save a town that had all but forgotten him. The trust was valid, Ainsworth confirmed, his voice unsteady, properly executed, witnessed by parties he could still name, entirely beyond the reach of any later lien or claim. All it had ever required was the delivery of the corpus and an heir to the intention willing to see it through. Ephraim had named the town as beneficiary. But the trust needed a trustee, a living person to administer the endowment and rekindle the light. And Ephraim's letter, Ainsworth noted with a strange, moved smile, had specified the qualification for that trustee in words that might have been written for the woman standing before him. Let it be someone who knows what it is to be cast out, and who keeps a light burning anyway. She came back to Harrow's Reach as its trustee, and the town that had thought her mad learned, over one extraordinary winter, exactly what a resourceful woman does with a fortune that was never meant for her. Miriam Thorne did not take a single coin for herself. She spent Ephraim Locke's gold precisely as he had dreamed it spent, and she spent it the way her mother had taught her to move through a lean pantry, seeing everywhere the value that others had overlooked. First, the light itself. She hired Jonah Reddick and every idle young man still left in town to shore up the leaning foundation with quarried stone, to rebuild the rotted stairs, to reglaze the shattered lantern room, and she used her father's tools and her own patient hands to restore the great brass clockwork of the rotating lens, coaxing life back into the stopped mechanism exactly as Amos Vale had once coaxed it back into ruined watches on a high stool in Cheswick. On a clear, cold evening in December, before the whole gathered town, Miriam Thorne climbed the mended stairs of Widow's Finger and lit the lamp that had been dark for 30 years, and the beam swept out across the black water and touched the harbor mouth, and grown fishermen, who had not wept since childhood, stood on the wharf and wept without shame. But she did not stop at the light, because Ephraim's trust had been endowed for the town, and the town was more than its beacon. With the remainder, she established a fund at the wharf to pay fair prices for fish, breaking Harlan Crocker's stranglehold on the scales overnight, so that a man's catch was worth what it was worth, and not what Crocker deigned to give. She bought back, quietly and through Ainsworth's firm, the most ruinous of the mortgages Crocker held over the town's families, and she forgave the interest, asking only that those who could would pay forward what they were able into a common fund for the next lean winter. And as for Harlan Crocker himself, she did not ruin him, though she could have. She simply rendered him unnecessary. A town that no longer needed his rope had no more use for his price, and one by one the families he had held in his fist stood free of it, until the great man of Harrow's Reach found himself the small man he had always, underneath, been. He left before spring, selling his store at a loss to the very people he had bled, and no one went down to the wharf to see him go. It was not vengeance. It was something quieter and more complete, the simple withdrawal of the fear he had lived on. The one who had wronged the town faced, in the end, only the justice of being seen clearly at last the same fate, Miriam thought, that eventually finds every man who reads only the names on paper and never the worth of what stands before him. And far up the coast, in the valley she had lost, a smaller justice arrived in its own time. The story of the widow of Widow's Finger, the woman cast out with $11 who had lit a dead lighthouse and saved a drowning town, traveled the coast road the way such stories do, and it reached at last the ears of Elias Thorne, who had let the orchard go to ruin because he had never in his life learned to tend anything he had not simply been given. The valley farm, run without care, failed within 3 years. But the story did more than that. It reached the county judge who had ruled against her, and it reached the neighbors who had looked at their boots, and it made of Miriam Thorne not a widow to be pitied, but a name to be reckoned with, so that when at last she chose to speak of how the Thorne land had been taken from her, people who had once looked away now listened. She never got the orchard back, and in the end, she found she did not want it. She had built something no man could sign away, not a farm, not a fortune, but a place that owed its very light to her, and a town full of people who knew exactly what she was worth. She was 40 years old. The autumn, everything she had ever built was taken from her, and she stood at the edge of the continent with $11 and nowhere in the world that would call her by name, Remember her that way, because it is the whole meaning of the thing. A brother-in-law who read only the deed cast her out of her home. The law that reads only names left her with nothing. And in her desperation, she spent nearly her last coin on a leaning, rotted, useless tower that any sensible person would have laughed at. But she was her father's daughter and her mother's, and she carried in her the one belief the world can never legislate away, that the forgotten things are only waiting for someone willing to look closer. Beneath the stairs of that foolish purchase lay a lonely man's 30-year-old promise, and Miriam Thorne, who knew better than anyone alive what it was to be cast out and keep a light burning anyway, did not seize it for herself. She spent it to bring a drowning town home through the dark, exactly as its keeper had dreamed. That is what she did with the buried secret. She was the trustee the dead man had described without ever meeting her, someone who knew what it was to be cast out and who kept a light burning anyway. And every night, for the rest of her long life, the beam swept out across the water from Widow's Finger and said to every soul on the Black Sea the only thing it had ever meant to say: you are seen. You are not alone. There is a way home. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us, and for sitting with Miriam Thorne all the way from that cold spit of rock to the night she rekindled the light. If her story moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that being written off is not the same as being finished, that what the world discards is so often only waiting for the right pair of eyes. Before you go, we'd love for you to sit with one gentle question and leave your answer in the comments below. When was there a time you found real value in something or someone, perhaps even yourself, that others had already written off? We read every word you leave us, and we carry your stories into the next one. Until then, keep your own light burning for whoever might be out on the dark water, looking for the way home. Until next time, stay close.